The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Bella Vista, the upscale Italian restaurant that had become the crown jewel of downtown's restaurant district. David Coleman adjusted his tie one final time before stepping out of his black Mercedes, the weight of today's decision heavy on his shoulders. After 18 months of running the restaurant from behind the scenes, today would be different. Today, he would walk through those doors not as the invisible owner, but as a customer, with his family. Hi, my beautiful family. Let me begin with a prayer straight from the heart. Dear God, please bless every soul watching this video. Fill their lives with peace, joy, and endless love. Amen. Welcome back, my family. You are not just viewers. You are my light during the dark days and my reason to keep going. To all new family members, welcome to the family. Please subscribe to the channel and introduce yourself in the comments. I truly want to know more about you. My beloved family, every story I bring is not just words, it is my sweat, my sleepless nights, and my sacrifice. When you leave early, it cuts deep as if my hard work is unseen and my voice unheard. Please stay till the end. I love you. Now let's begin the story. Daddy, this place looks fancy, whispered 8-year-old Zoe, her wide brown eyes taking in the elegant facade. She smoothed down her yellow sundress, the one she'd insisted on wearing because it was restaurant pretty. That's because it is fancy, sweetheart, David replied, lifting her hand to his lips for a gentle kiss. And you look absolutely perfect. His wife, Amelia, emerged from the passenger side, stunning in a simple black dress that somehow made her look both elegant and approachable. After 15 years of marriage, she still took his breath away. But today, there was something else in her expression, concern mixed with curiosity. You sure about this, honey? She asked quietly, taking his arm. I mean, I understand wanting to see how the staff treats customers when you're not around, but bringing Zoe. David's jaw tightened slightly. That's exactly why I need to bring her. This restaurant will be hers someday. She needs to know what kind of world she's inheriting. The truth was more complicated than that, and they both knew it. Over the past 6 months, David had been hearing whispers, subtle complaints from black customers about poor service, reports of uncomfortable interactions, staff members who seemed to treat certain guests differently. When you own a restaurant but rarely eat in the dining room, these things can slip by unnoticed. Until they can't. As they approached the mahogany doors, David caught his reflection in the glass. At 42, he was tall and broad-shouldered, his dark skin complemented by the expensive navy suit he'd chosen specifically for today. He looked every inch the successful businessman he was, but he wondered if that would matter to the staff who only knew him as a voice on the phone or a signature on their paychecks. The hostess, a young blonde woman named Jessica whom David recognized from her hiring photo, looked up with a practiced smile that seemed to freeze slightly when she saw them. Good afternoon, David said warmly. Table for 3, please. Of course, Jessica replied, her smile returning but somehow smaller now. Do you have a reservation? No, but I called earlier and was told you could accommodate walk-ins before 5. A pause. Jessica's eyes flickered toward the dining room, which was clearly less than half full, then back to them. Let me check what we have available. David and Amelia exchanged a glance. In 18 months of owning this restaurant, David had never once seen a hostess check availability when the dining room was this empty on a Tuesday afternoon. Actually, Jessica said after consulting her book, though David noticed she hadn't actually written anything down or checked any computer system, we might have something in about 20 minutes? If you don't mind waiting. 20 minutes. Amelia's voice carried just a hint of edge. For a table in a half-empty restaurant? Well, you see, we have several reservations coming in, and... It's fine, David interrupted gently, placing a calming hand on Amelia's arm. His voice remained perfectly pleasant, but his eyes were sharp, taking in every detail of this interaction. "We'll wait." As they moved toward the small waiting area near the bar, David spotted something that made his blood run cold. There at table 12, a prime spot by the window, sat the Henderson family, who were white, being seated immediately despite having arrived after them. He watched as they were greeted warmly, offered wine menus, and settled in without any mention of a wait time. "Daddy," Zoe tugged at his sleeve, her voice small and confused, "why did those people get to sit down right away?" The innocence in her question hit him like a physical blow. This was exactly what he'd feared, exactly why he'd needed to see for himself. But experiencing it with his 8-year-old daughter made it infinitely worse. "Sometimes restaurants get very busy, sweetheart," he said quietly, kneeling down to her level. "We just have to be patient." But over her head, his eyes met Amelia's, and in that shared look was 18 years of marriage, of facing the world together, of protecting their daughter from truths she wasn't ready for. The look that said, "She's starting to understand." After exactly 23 minutes, David had been counting, Jessica returned with a hostess smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Right this way," she said, leading them not to one of the many empty tables by the windows, but to a small table in the back corner, near the kitchen doors and away from the main dining area. The table was technically clean, but it wobbled slightly when Amelia placed her purse on it. The lighting was dim, the noise from the kitchen intrusive, and the view was of a blank wall adorned with a single slightly crooked picture of the Italian countryside. "Your server will be right with you," Jessica said quickly, practically fleeing back to her hostess station. David looked around the corner where they'd been seated. Every other table back here was empty. Meanwhile, the bright, airy main dining room with its view of the street and natural light remained peppered with unoccupied tables that were apparently reserved. Their server approached, a tall, thin man with sandy brown hair and a name tag reading Tyler. David recognized him immediately from the staff files. Tyler Morrison, 24 years old, hired 6 months ago, good reviews from management. On paper, he'd seemed like exactly the kind of enthusiastic young professional they wanted representing Bella Vista. "Welcome to Bella Vista," Tyler said, his voice carrying the practiced restaurant cheerfulness. But something in his eyes shifted as he took in the family before him. "Can I start you with some waters?" "That would be great," David replied. "And could we also see a wine list?" Tyler hesitated for just a fraction of a second, so briefly that someone who wasn't watching carefully might have missed it. But David caught it, that tiny pause that spoke volumes. "Of course," Tyler said. "I'll get those waters right out." As Tyler walked away, David noticed him stop at the server station and engage in a brief, whispered conversation with another server, a conversation that involved several glances back toward their table. "Something's not right here," Amelia murmured, keeping her voice low so Zoe wouldn't overhear. "I know," David replied grimly. "But let's see how this plays out." When Tyler returned with their waters, his demeanor had shifted again. The fake cheerfulness was gone, replaced by something that could only be described as barely concealed contempt. "Here you go," he said, setting the glasses down with slightly more force than necessary. Water sloshed onto the table. "So sorry about that. Let me get you some napkins." But instead of immediately fetching napkins, Tyler pulled out his phone and appeared to be texting someone. David watched as his thumbs moved rapidly across the screen, Tyler's eyes occasionally flicking up to look at them with an expression that was growing more hostile by the minute. What happened next would replay in David's mind for years to come. Tyler returned to their table, but instead of napkins, he carried a pitcher of ice water. Without warning, without provocation, without any explanation whatsoever, he appended the entire pitcher over Zoe's head. The ice-cold water cascaded down her yellow dress, soaking her hair, her clothes, her new patent leather shoes. Zoe gasped, A sharp, shocked sound that cut through the restaurant's ambient noise like a knife. Tyler. Jessica's voice carried from across the restaurant, sharp with what sounded like genuine horror. But Tyler wasn't done. As Zoe sat there, dripping and shivering, tears beginning to form in her eyes, Tyler leaned down close to their table and spoke in a voice loud enough for nearby diners to hear. Maybe you people should stick to places more appropriate for your kind. This is a respectable establishment. The restaurant had gone dead silent. Every conversation stopped. Every fork paused halfway to waiting mouths. The only sounds were the gentle drip of water from Zoe's hair onto the floor and the barely contained fury in David's breathing. David stood slowly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. At his full height, he towered over Tyler, who suddenly seemed to realize that perhaps he'd made a terrible mistake. "Did you just—" David's voice was deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that made nearby diners lean forward to hear, "Pour water on my 8-year-old daughter?" Tyler's face had gone pale, but his chin lifted defiantly. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but people like you need to understand." "People like me?" David's voice rose just slightly, but the increase in volume seemed to fill the entire restaurant. "Daddy." Zoe's voice was small, confused, hurt in a way that went far deeper than cold water and wet clothes. "Why did he do that? Did I do something wrong?" And in that moment, as David looked down at his daughter, his brilliant, kind, innocent daughter who collected rocks and wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up, who had never hurt anyone in her entire 8 years of life, something crystallized inside him. This wasn't just about poor service or discrimination. This was about a man who had just taught his daughter that her skin color made her unwelcome in the world. This was about an employee who worked for him, took his money, and apparently despised everything he represented. This was about to become very interesting. "What's your name?" David asked Tyler, his voice still that dangerous quiet. "What's it to you?" Tyler shot back, though some of his bravado was beginning to crack. David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet, extracting a business card with deliberate slowness. He held it out to Tyler, who took it reflexively. Tyler looked down at the card. His face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, recognition, disbelief, and finally, pure terror. The card read, "David Coleman, owner and managing director, Bella Vista Restaurant Group." Tyler's hand began to shake. What do you think happens next? How would you handle discovering that your own employee treated your family this way? Drop a comment and let me know. The business card fluttered to the floor as Tyler's trembling fingers lost their grip. The small piece of cardstock seemed to echo in the silence that had engulfed the entire restaurant. David watched as the color drained from Tyler's face, his cocky demeanor crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. That's not. Tyler stammered, his eyes darting between the card and David's face. "You can't be." "Can't be what?" David's voice remained dangerously calm as he reached down to retrieve the fallen card. "Can't be the owner of the restaurant you just humiliated a child in? Can't be the man who signs your paychecks? Or can't be black and successful at the same time?" The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. Around them, David could hear the whispered conversation starting up again, phones being discreetly pulled out to record what was clearly about to become a very public reckoning. Amelia had wrapped her arms around Zoe, using her own napkin to dab at their daughter's wet hair. "Shoo, baby, it's okay," she murmured, but her eyes never left Tyler's face. If David was controlled fury, Amelia was ice-cold judgment. From across the restaurant, David heard rapid footsteps approaching. Marcus Rivera, the general manager David had hired but rarely worked with in person, appeared at their table, his face flushed and panicked. "Mr. Coleman." Marcus's voice was breathless, as if he'd run from the office. "Sir, I am so incredibly sorry. I had no idea you were, if I had known you were dining here today." "You would have what, Marcus?" David's attention shifted to his general manager, and Marcus visibly flinched. "Treated us differently? Made sure we got better service? Or would you have just made sure Tyler here knew who I was so he could pretend to be a decent human being?" Marcus's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. Behind him, David could see other staff members gathering: Jessica the hostess, 2 other servers, and a busboy he didn't recognize. They all wore the same expression of dawning horror as they realized what had just happened. "Sir, please let me explain," Marcus began. "Explain what?" David's voice cut through Marcus's stammering. "Explain why my 8-year-old daughter is sitting here soaking wet because your server thought it was appropriate to pour water on her? Explain why we were given the worst table in the restaurant despite arriving to a half-empty dining room? Or maybe you'd like to explain why this young man felt comfortable enough in your establishment to tell me and my family that we should find somewhere more appropriate for our kind?" Each word landed like a physical blow. Marcus looked as if he might be sick. "Daddy," Zoe's small voice interrupted the confrontation, "I'm cold." The simple statement from his daughter refocused David's attention on what really mattered. He immediately shrugged out of his suit jacket and wrapped it around Zoe's small frame. The jacket engulfed her, but it was warm and dry and smelled like her father's cologne. Safe things in a world that had just shown her a very ugly face. "We need to get her home and into dry clothes," Amelia said quietly, her voice carrying an edge that David recognized. His wife was past angry and well into the realm of protective fury that made her truly formidable. "Of course," David said, but his eyes remained fixed on Tyler, who seemed to be having some sort of breakdown. The young man's face was white as paper, and his hands were shaking so violently that he'd clasped them behind his back to hide it. But as David bent down to pick up his daughter, Tyler's voice cracked through the tension like a whip. "This is bullshit." Every head in the restaurant turned. Marcus made a sound like a strangled yelp. Even the kitchen noise seemed to pause. Tyler's fear had transformed into something desperate and ugly. "You think you can just come in here and ruin my life because you're rich? Because you can buy and sell people like me? Well, congratulations, you won. You get to play the victim and I get to be the villain, right? That's how this works, isn't it?" David straightened slowly, his hand protectively on Zoe's shoulder. "Son, I think you need to stop talking." "No." Tyler's voice was rising, cracking with emotion. "You want to know the truth? You want to know why I did what I did? It's because I'm tired. I'm tired of people like you coming in here, acting like you own the place." "I do own the place," David said quietly. "Acting like the world owes you something special. Like you deserve better treatment just because of your skin color. Well, what about people like me? What about working-class white people who can't catch a break because everything has to be about diversity and inclusion and making sure everyone else gets ahead while we get left behind?" The restaurant had gone deadly silent again. David felt Amelia's hand slip into his, felt Zoe press closer against his leg. This was the moment he'd feared, not just the discrimination, but having his daughter witness this level of raw hatred directed at people who looked like her. But Tyler wasn't done. "You think you're better than me because you wear expensive suits and drive fancy cars? You think your money makes you more American than I am? Well, let me tell you something. This is still America. And some of us remember when this country was great, when people knew their place and—" "Tyler." David's voice cut through the rant like a blade. "Stop. Right now." There was something in David's tone, not anger, not even authority, but something deeper and more commanding, that finally penetrated Tyler's hysteria. The young man's mouth snapped shut, but his chest was still heaving with rage and fear. David looked around the restaurant, taking in the faces of the other diners. Some looked horrified by Tyler's outburst. Others seemed uncomfortable, unsure whether they should intervene or pretend they hadn't heard. A few, and this bothered David more than Tyler's obvious racism, looked almost approving, as if Tyler had said things they'd been thinking but never dared voice. Have you ever witnessed a moment like this in public? What do you think David should do next? Respond with anger, try to educate, or simply walk away? Share your thoughts below. David took a deep breath, then knelt down so he was at eye level with his daughter. Zoe, sweetheart, I need you to go with Mommy to the bathroom and get cleaned up, okay? I'll be right here when you get back. But Daddy. It's okay, baby girl. Mommy's going to take care of you, and I'm going to take care of this. I promise. Amelia gave him a look that said be careful, then scooped Zoe up in her arms. As they walked away, David could hear his daughter asking, Mommy, why was that man so mean? What did he mean about our skin color? David's heart broke a little more with each word. When they were out of earshot, David turned back to Tyler, who was now surrounded by Marcus and two other staff members who looked like they were ready to physically restrain him if necessary. Tyler, David said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority, you're fired. Obviously. Security will escort you out, and you can pick up your final paycheck on Friday. Don't come back. Tyler's face twisted with bitter satisfaction. Fine. You think you're punishing me? You think I want to work for someone like you anyway? You people always stick together, always make sure you get yours while the rest of us. Tyler. Marcus finally found his voice. Enough. Security. But David held up a hand. No. Let him finish. Let him get it all out. Tyler looked surprised by this, but the hatred in his eyes didn't diminish. You want me to finish? Fine. You want to know what I really think? I think you're just another rich black guy who thinks the world owes him something. I think you bought this restaurant to make some kind of point, to show off, to wave your success in people's faces. And I think you probably enjoyed this whole thing, getting to play the victim, getting to be the righteous one, getting to destroy someone's life because they don't worship at the altar of political correctness. David listened to every word, his expression never changing. When Tyler finally ran out of steam, David nodded slowly. Are you done? Tyler's jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful, but he nodded. Good. Now let me tell you what I think. David's voice carried across the restaurant, not loud but somehow filling every corner of the space. I think you're a young man who's scared. I think you've been told your whole life that the world works a certain way, that certain people belong in certain places, and that anyone who challenges that is somehow taking something away from you. I think you've been fed a steady diet of resentment and fear, and you mistake that poison for truth. Tyler's face was flushed, but he was listening. I think you looked at my family today and saw everything you've been taught to hate, successful black people in a space you consider yours. I think you saw my daughter's innocence and joy, and something in you wanted to crush it because it reminded you of everything you've been told you can't have. David paused, letting his words sink in. But here's what I know, Tyler. I know that I didn't buy this restaurant to make a point or show off. I bought it because I love food, I love hospitality, and I wanted to create a place where every person, regardless of their skin color, their background, or their bank account, could come and feel welcome. I know that I've worked 16-hour days for 18 months trying to build something beautiful here. And I know that until today, I had no idea that I was employing someone who saw my family as less than human. The restaurant was so quiet that David could hear the ice maker cycling in the kitchen. So yes, you're fired. Not because you're white, not because I'm on some kind of power trip, but because you just demonstrated that you're incapable of treating all customers with basic human dignity. And in the hospitality business, that's not a political position, it's a job requirement. Tyler's composure finally shattered completely. Tears began streaming down his face, whether from rage, shame, fear, or some combination of all three, David couldn't tell. "You don't understand," Tyler said, his voice breaking. "You don't know what it's like to grow up watching your parents lose everything, watching your town die, watching everyone who looks like you get blamed for every problem in America. You don't know what it's like to be told you're privileged when you've never felt privileged a day in your life." For the first time since this whole confrontation began, David felt something other than anger. Not sympathy, exactly, but a kind of recognition. "You're right," David said quietly. "I don't know what that's like. Just like you don't know what it's like to be followed around stores, to be questioned about whether you really belong in nice restaurants, to have to prepare your 8-year-old daughter for the reality that some people will hate her before they even meet her." Tyler wiped his nose with the back of his hand, leaving him looking very young and very lost. "The difference is," David continued, "that my experiences taught me to fight harder for dignity, for everyone's dignity. Your experiences taught you to take dignity away from others. That's not about economics or politics, Tyler. That's about character." Marcus stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, should I call the police?" David considered this for a moment, looking at Tyler's tear-streaked face, his shaking hands, his obvious desperation. "No," David said finally. "No police. But I want you to escort Mr. Morrison out of the building. I want his keycards deactivated immediately, and I want a security guard here for the rest of the evening in case he decides to come back." Tyler seemed to deflate at David's words. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean to hurt your daughter. I was angry, and You poured ice water on an 8-year-old child," David said, his voice like steel. "Whatever you meant or didn't mean, that's what you did. And that little girl will remember this day for the rest of her life." As if summoned by his words, Amelia and Zoe returned from the bathroom. Zoe was still wearing David's oversized suit jacket, her hair somewhat drier but still damp. She looked small and uncertain, staying close to her mother's side. When Zoe saw Tyler, she instinctively pressed closer to Amelia. "Is that the mean man, Mommy?" The question hit Tyler like a physical blow. He looked at Zoe, really looked at her for the first time, and seemed to see not a symbol of everything he resented, but an actual child. A child he had hurt. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words barely audible. "Little girl, I'm so sorry." But Zoe just buried her face in Amelia's dress, and Tyler's apology fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. Marcus and the security guard, who had appeared as if from nowhere, flanked Tyler. As they began to escort him toward the exit, Tyler turned back one last time. "Mr. Coleman," he called out, his voice cracking. "For what it's worth, you're right about the character thing. I don't know how to be different than I am." David watched as the young man was led away, feeling a complex mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Anger, yes. Sadness, certainly. But also something that might have been pity. As the front door closed behind Tyler, the normal sounds of the restaurant slowly began to resume. Conversations picked up again, silverware clinked against plates, and the world continued turning. But David knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. The silence that followed Tyler's departure felt different from the shocked hush that had dominated the restaurant moments before. This was the uncomfortable quiet of people who had witnessed something they couldn't unsee, couldn't unhear, and weren't quite sure how to process. David looked around the dining room, taking in the faces of the other patrons. Some were staring openly, others pretending to focus intently on their meals while clearly straining to hear every word. A few had their phones out, no doubt already uploading videos to social media with captions he could only imagine. "Sir," Marcus approached tentatively, his voice barely above a whisper, "what would you like me to tell the other guests? Should I make an announcement or—" David considered this. Every instinct told him to gather his family and leave, to retreat to the safety of their home and deal with this crisis privately. But another part of him, the part that had built a business from nothing, that had fought for respect in boardrooms where he was often the only black face, knew that how he handled the next few minutes would define not just this evening, but the future of everything he'd worked to build. "No announcement," David said finally. "But I want you to personally visit every table. Apologize for the disruption. Offer to comp their meals if they'd like to leave, and assure those who stay that this kind of behavior doesn't represent the values of this establishment." Marcus nodded vigorously. "Of course, sir. Absolutely. And sir, I want you to know that I had no idea Tyler felt that way. If I had known, if there had been any sign—" "We'll discuss your oversight later, Marcus." David's tone was measured but firm. "Right now, I need you focused on damage control." As Marcus hurried away to begin his apology tour, David turned his attention to his family. Amelia had settled back into her chair, but she kept one protective arm around Zoe, who was still wrapped in David's suit jacket like a small, uncertain bird. "Daddy," Zoe's voice was small but clear, "why did that man hate us? We didn't do anything to him." Before David could answer, an elderly white woman at a nearby table stood up and walked over to them. She was elegantly dressed, probably in her 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Excuse me," she said gently, addressing Zoe directly. "I just wanted you to know that not all people think like that man. Some of us think you and your family are lovely, and we're very sorry about what happened to you." Zoe looked up at the woman with curiosity. "You do?" "I do indeed," the woman smiled. "My name is Mrs. Patterson, and I've been coming to this restaurant since it opened. Your daddy has created something very special here, and that man, well, that man was just very confused and very wrong." David felt a knot in his chest loosen slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. That's very kind of you to say." But Mrs. Patterson wasn't finished. "Actually, Mr. Coleman, I wonder if I might speak with you privately for a moment? There's something I think you should know." David exchanged a glance with Amelia, who nodded. "Of course." Mrs. Patterson gestured toward the bar area, away from curious ears. As they walked, David noticed that her steps were sure and purposeful despite her age. "Mr. Coleman," she began once they were out of earshot, "I need to tell you that what happened today wasn't an isolated incident." David's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "I mean that young man, Tyler. He's been problematic for a while now. I've witnessed him making comments, giving poor service to certain customers, making people feel unwelcome. I should have said something sooner, but I wasn't sure who to tell, and honestly, I hoped it would resolve itself." David felt the weight of this revelation like a stone in his stomach. What kind of comments? What kind of service issues? Mrs. Patterson glanced around nervously, then lowered her voice. "Last month, I saw him seat a young black couple near the kitchen, just like he did with your family, while there were perfectly good tables available in the main dining room. When the gentleman complained, Tyler told him that those tables were reserved, which was clearly untrue because they remained empty for the rest of the evening." David's hands clenched into fists. "Go on." 2 weeks ago, I overheard him telling another server that he was tired of having to pretend to be nice to certain customers. He used some unpleasant language that I won't repeat in front of your daughter, but the meaning was clear. Mrs. Patterson paused, then continued with obvious discomfort. "And Mr. Coleman, I have to tell you something else. Tyler wasn't acting alone today. What do you mean? I saw Jessica, your hostess, texting someone right after she seated your family. She was looking at your table and typing furiously. A few minutes later, Tyler came out from the back and went straight to her station. They had a conversation, and then Tyler went to your table with that pitcher of water. The implications hit David like a freight train. This wasn't just one racist employee having a breakdown. This was coordinated harassment, possibly involving multiple staff members. Are you certain about this? David asked, though he could see the certainty in Mrs. Patterson's eyes. I'm certain. And Mr. Coleman, there may be others. I've seen staff members exchange looks, heard whispered conversations that stopped when certain customers walked by. I think you have a bigger problem than just one bad employee. David ran a hand over his face, suddenly feeling every one of his 42 years. Mrs. Patterson, why didn't you say something sooner? Why didn't you call the management, or? Because I'm a 73-year-old white woman who wasn't sure anyone would believe me, she said simply. Because I've seen enough in my lifetime to know that sometimes speaking up just makes things worse for the people you're trying to help. And because... She hesitated, then continued with obvious shame, because part of me hoped I was wrong. David studied this woman who had just potentially saved his business by coming forward. You weren't wrong. And thank you for telling me. They walked back to the table in silence, David's mind racing. If Mrs. Patterson was right, and her detailed account suggested she was, then Bella Vista had a systemic problem that went far beyond Tyler Morrison. The thought that his own employees had been discriminating against customers, while he remained blissfully unaware, made him feel sick. As they approached the table, David saw that Amelia was in deep conversation with Zoe, clearly trying to explain the unexplainable. But when she looked up and saw his expression, her face immediately reflected his concern. "What's wrong?" she asked quietly. Before he could answer, Marcus appeared at their table again, but this time he wasn't alone. Jessica, the hostess, was with him, and she looked like she'd been crying. "Mr. Coleman," Marcus said, his voice strained, "Jessica has something she needs to tell you." Jessica stepped forward, her hands shaking. She was very young, probably no more than 22, and she looked absolutely terrified. "Mr. Coleman, I need to confess something." Her voice was barely audible. "Tyler asked me to. He told me to seat you in the back section. He said it would be funny to make you wait and then put you at the worst table. I went along with it because I thought he was just being mean about difficult customers, but then when I saw you with your little girl, and when Tyler did what he did..." She broke off, sobbing. "Jessica," David's voice was carefully controlled, "are you telling me that you deliberately provided poor service to my family based on Tyler's instructions?" "Yes," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I didn't think. I never imagined he would do something so awful. I thought it was just going to be bad service, not that." Amelia stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on Jessica. "You thought it was okay to give us bad service because we're black?" "No. I mean, I didn't think of it that way. Tyler just said, he said you people always complain anyway, so we might as well give you something to complain about. He made it sound like it was normal, like everyone did it." The words hung in the air like poison gas. David felt Zoe's small hand slip into his, and he realized she'd been listening to every word. "Daddy," Zoe said quietly, "what does you people mean?" David knelt down to his daughter's level, his heart breaking as he saw the confusion and hurt in her 8-year-old eyes. This was the conversation he'd hoped to delay for years, the moment when innocence collided with the harsh realities of the world. "Sweetheart," he said gently, "sometimes people make judgments about other people based on what they look like on the outside, instead of getting to know what they're like on the inside. When they say you people, they're talking about people who have the same skin color as us." But why would they do that? That's not nice. No, baby girl, it's not nice. It's actually very unfair. But some people were taught wrong things when they were growing up, and they never learned better. Zoe processed this with a serious concentration that only children can muster. So they were mean to us because our skin is brown? David felt tears prick at his eyes. That's part of it, yes. But I like our skin, Zoe said with the simple certainty of childhood. It's pretty. And it matches yours and Mommy's. I like our skin too, sweetheart. And you're right, it is pretty. Zoe looked thoughtfully at Jessica, who was still crying. Did someone teach her wrong things too? David glanced up at Jessica, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. I think maybe they did, Zoe. Can she learn better things? The innocence of the question, the lack of malice in his daughter's voice as she looked at someone who had just participated in discriminating against her, took David's breath away. Here was his 8-year-old daughter, still believing that people could change, still offering grace to those who had hurt her. David stood up and looked directly at Jessica. Can you, Jessica? Can you learn better things? Jessica's sobs intensified. I want to. I want to so badly. Mr. Coleman, I grew up in a small town where everyone looked like me, and I never had to think about this stuff. When I moved here for college, Tyler was one of the first people who was nice to me, and when he said things, I just went along with it because I wanted to fit in. But seeing what happened today, seeing your little girl's face when Tyler poured that water on her. She couldn't finish the sentence. Jessica, Amelia said, her voice still cold but no longer furious. Do you understand that what you did was discrimination? Do you understand that you made our daughter feel unwelcome in her own father's restaurant? Yes, Jessica whispered. Yes, I understand. And I hate myself for it. David looked at this young woman, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't expected to see, genuine remorse. Not just fear of consequences, but actual understanding of the harm she'd caused. Marcus, David said without taking his eyes off Jessica, I want you to review every customer complaint we've received in the past 6 months. Cross-reference them with server assignments, table assignments, everything. I want to know the full scope of what's been happening here. Yes, sir. Immediately. And Jessica, David turned back to the hostess, you're suspended pending a full investigation. If you're truly sorry, if you really want to learn better things as my daughter put it, then you'll cooperate fully with that investigation. You'll tell us everything you know about Tyler's behavior, about any other staff members who might have been involved, and about every incident you witnessed or participated in. Jessica nodded frantically. Anything. I'll tell you anything you want to know. Good. Because right now, you have a choice. You can be part of the problem, or you can be part of the solution. But you don't get to be neither. As Marcus led Jessica away to begin what David suspected would be a very long and very uncomfortable conversation, he turned back to his family. Amelia was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read, and Zoe was still wrapped in his suit jacket, looking small but somehow not defeated. What happens now, Daddy? Zoe asked. David sat back down and pulled his daughter onto his lap. Now, baby girl, we figure out how to make sure this never happens to anyone else. Can we do that? David looked around his restaurant, the restaurant he'd poured his heart and soul into, the restaurant that was supposed to be his legacy for his daughter, and made a decision that would change everything. Yes, sweetheart. We can do that. And we will. But as he spoke those words, David couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead of them. Because fixing a problem required first understanding how deep it went, and he was beginning to suspect that what they'd witnessed today was just the tip of a very large and very ugly iceberg. The evening was far from over, and the real work hadn't even begun. 3 hours later, Bella Vista had transformed from an elegant dining establishment into something resembling a war room. David had sent Amelia and Zoe home after Zoe fell asleep in the booth, still wrapped in his suit jacket, exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. Now, as the last dinner customers filtered out, David sat across from Marcus in the restaurant's back office, surrounded by employee files, customer complaint logs, and a growing pile of evidence that made his stomach turn. "How many?" David asked quietly, not looking up from the complaint he was reading. A detailed account from a black businessman who had been kept waiting 45 minutes for a table despite having a confirmed reservation, then seated at the same back corner table where David's own family had been placed. Marcus's voice was hoarse from 3 hours of phone calls and interviews. 17 confirmed incidents in the past 6 months. But David, I think there are more. A lot more. Most people don't complain formally when they receive bad service. They just don't come back. David finally looked up from the papers. 17 incidents that we know about. In 6 months. In my restaurant. The weight of those words settled over both men like a heavy blanket. David had built Bella Vista to be a place of welcome, of celebration, of community. Instead, it had become a place where people were judged by their skin color and treated accordingly. "Tell me about the staff," David said. "Who knew? Who participated? Who looked the other way?" Marcus consulted his notes with trembling hands. Despite being the general manager, he looked like a man who had just discovered he'd been living in a house of cards that was now collapsing around him. Jessica gave us a full statement. Tyler was the ringleader, but it wasn't just him. There were at least 3 other servers who went along with his system. They had code words, David. Actual code words for when black customers came in. David closed his eyes. What kind of code words? Special seating requests meant put them in the back section. VIP treatment meant slow service. Chef's recommendation meant push the most expensive items and hope they couldn't afford it so you could be condescending when they asked for something cheaper. Each revelation hit David like a physical blow. This wasn't random prejudice. This was organized discrimination happening under his own roof, funded by his own money, carried out by people he had trusted to represent his values. Marcus cleared his throat nervously. "David, there's something else. Something worse." How could it be worse? They kept a list. David's blood went cold. What kind of list? Marcus slid a piece of paper across the desk. It was a sheet of notebook paper, covered in different handwriting, with names, dates, and brief descriptions. The header, written in Tyler's distinctive scrawl, read, "Problem customers, handle accordingly." David scanned the list, his horror growing with each entry. Williams family, April 15th, made them wait 30 minutes, complained about everything as usual. Johnson businessman, April 22nd, kept asking for manager, typical attitude problem. Davis couple 5/3, she was dressed too fancy, probably trying to show off. Martinez family 5/10, kids were loud, parents didn't control them. There were dozens of entries, and they weren't all black families. David saw Hispanic surnames, what appeared to be Muslim names, and even some entries that seemed to target people for their clothing, their perceived economic status, or other arbitrary characteristics. But the overwhelming majority were black families. Families like his own. "Where did you find this?" David's voice was barely above a whisper. "Jessica told us about it. Said Tyler kept it in his locker, shared it with the other servers so they'd know which customers to watch out for. She said she never wrote on it herself, but she saw it and never reported it." David stared at the list, trying to process the systematic nature of what had been happening. This wasn't just individual prejudice. This was an organized campaign of discrimination that had been running for months right under his nose. "Marcus," David said finally, "I need you to tell me something, and I need you to be completely honest." "Of course. Did you know?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with shame. "I suspected something wasn't right. I noticed patterns in seating assignments, differences in how certain customers were treated. But I told myself it was just personality conflicts between staff and difficult customers. I told myself that every restaurant has service issues, that people complain about everything these days." "So you knew something was wrong, but you chose not to investigate." "I chose not to see it," Marcus admitted, "because seeing it would have meant admitting that I had failed as a manager. That I had let this happen in a restaurant I was supposed to be running properly." David appreciated the honesty, even as it made him angrier. "How many other managers are there, Marcus? How many other people in positions of authority who chose not to see what was happening to my customers?" Before Marcus could answer, there was a knock on the office door. David looked up to see Sarah Chun, the evening shift supervisor, standing in the doorway. She looked nervous but determined. "Mr. Coleman? I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's something I need to tell you." David gestured for her to sit down. Sarah was one of his most reliable employees, a 28-year-old culinary school graduate who had worked her way up from server to supervisor in the 18 months since Bella Vista opened. "What is it, Sarah?" "I recorded Tyler tonight. When he was having his breakdown after you fired him. I got it on my phone." She pulled out her device and set it on the desk. "I thought you might need evidence, in case he tries to deny what he said or claim he was wrongfully terminated." David looked at the phone, then at Sarah. "Why did you think to record him?" Sarah's expression darkened. "Because this isn't the first time Tyler has shown his true colors. I've been trying to build a case against him for months, but I needed proof. I needed something that management couldn't dismiss or explain away." David felt a spark of hope for the first time all evening. "Sarah, are you telling me that someone was actually paying attention? Someone was actually trying to do something about this?" "Yes, sir. But I was doing it the wrong way. I was trying to handle it internally, through proper channels. I documented incidents, I spoke to Marcus about my concerns, I even suggested additional diversity training for the staff. But nothing ever happened." She looked directly at Marcus, who squirmed under her gaze. "I was told that we needed to be careful about making accusations we couldn't prove. I was told that Tyler was just young and would mature with experience. I was told that customer complaints were often exaggerated or misunderstood." David felt his anger shifting. It wasn't just about Tyler anymore, or even about the other servers who had participated in the discrimination. It was about the entire system that had allowed this to continue, the management structure that had failed to protect his customers and his reputation. "Sarah," David said carefully, "I want you to tell me everything. Every incident you witnessed, every concern you raised, every time you were told to look the other way. I want dates, names, specifics. And I want to hear that recording." Sarah nodded and pressed play on her phone. Tyler's voice filled the small office, raw with emotion and ugly with prejudice. "Tired of people like you coming in here, acting like you own the place. People like you need to understand. This is still America, and some of us remember when this country was great, when people knew their place." David listened to the entire recording, his jaw clenched tight. When it finished, the office was silent except for the hum of the air conditioning. "He said all of this after he found out I was the owner," David said finally. "This wasn't just about bad service or individual prejudice. This was about his belief that people who look like me don't belong in positions of authority." That's exactly right, Sarah said. And Mr. Coleman, I have to tell you something else. Tyler wasn't the only one who felt that way. I heard conversations, staff members talking about how the real owner was probably some white investor, and you were just a front man. They literally couldn't believe that a black man could legitimately own and operate a restaurant like this. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. Not only had his employees been discriminating against black customers, they had been doing it while believing that he himself was a fraud, a pretender, someone who couldn't possibly have earned his position through merit and hard work. Who else? David asked quietly. Who else said things like that? Sarah consulted her own notes. David was impressed to see that she had been keeping detailed records. Kevin Martinez, one of the evening servers. He made several comments about diversity hires and affirmative action owners. Beth Williams from the morning shift. She suggested that you probably got special loans or government help because of your race. And Tom Patterson. Wait, David interrupted. Tom Patterson? The sous chef. Yes, sir. He's been making comments almost since day one. He told several people that he didn't believe you had the culinary knowledge to run a real restaurant, that you were probably just copying menus from other places. David rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. Tom Patterson was someone he had personally hired, someone whose resume had impressed him, someone he had trusted to help create the dining experience at Bella Vista. Sarah, I need you to be completely honest with me. In your professional opinion, as someone who has worked in this industry and in this restaurant specifically, how many of my employees respect me as their boss? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle but devastating. Mr. Coleman, I think most of your employees see you as a figurehead. They think the real decisions are made by other people, white people, and that you're just the face of the operation. They follow your directives because they have to, but they don't respect your authority or your expertise. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for months without David knowing it. He had spent 18 months building what he thought was his dream restaurant, only to discover that it had been built on a foundation of disrespect and discrimination. And the customers? David asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. The black customers who experienced discrimination? They assume you don't know what's happening, or worse, that you don't care. The white customers who witnessed it? Some of them are uncomfortable but don't want to get involved. Others. She hesitated. Others think it's normal. They expect to receive better service than black customers, and when they do, they don't question it. They just assume that's how restaurants work. David stood up and walked to the small window that overlooked the dining room. The beautiful space he had spent months designing, the carefully chosen furniture and artwork, the warm lighting that was supposed to make everyone feel welcome, all of it had been turned into a stage for systematic racism. Sarah, he said without turning around, if you were in my position, what would you do? Honestly? I'd burn it all down and start over. Fire everyone who participated, everyone who knew and said nothing, everyone who created or maintained this culture. I'd close for a week, retrain the entire remaining staff, and reopen with a public commitment to equality and inclusion. That would probably destroy the business, Marcus said quietly. The bad publicity, the disruption, the cost of starting over. David turned back to face them. Marcus, the business is already destroyed. We just didn't know it yet. He walked back to the desk and sat down, looking at the evidence spread out before him, the list of problem customers, the complaint logs, Sarah's detailed records of discrimination, the recording of Tyler's racist rant. Sarah, he said finally, I want you to help me do exactly what you suggested. We're going to burn it all down and start over. But we're going to do it right. For the first time all evening, Sarah smiled. Yes, sir. Where do we start? David looked at his watch. It was nearly midnight, but he felt more awake and focused than he had in months. We start by calling every person on Tyler's list. We start by apologizing, by explaining what happened, and by inviting them back to experience what Bella Vista should have been all along. And the staff? Marcus asked nervously. The staff who participated in discrimination? They're gone. The staff who knew about it and said nothing? They're on probation pending further investigation. The staff who tried to do the right thing, like Sarah here? They're getting promoted. David picked up Tyler's list and looked at it one more time. Tomorrow, he would start making phone calls that would be among the most difficult of his life. He would have to admit to strangers that his own restaurant had discriminated against them, that he had failed to protect them from the very prejudice he himself had experienced. But tonight, for the first time since Tyler had poured that ice water on his daughter's head, David felt something that might have been hope. His restaurant was broken, but it wasn't beyond repair. His staff had betrayed his trust, but not all of them. His dream had been corrupted, but the dream itself was still worth fighting for. The real work was just beginning. The next morning arrived gray and overcast, matching David's mood as he sat in his home office at 6 a.m., staring at a list of 17 phone numbers. 17 families who had been discriminated against in his restaurant. 17 conversations that would be among the most difficult of his professional life. Amelia appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, her silk robe wrapped tightly against the morning chill. You've been up all night, haven't you? David accepted the coffee gratefully. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing Zoe's face when Tyler poured that water on her. And then I'd think about all the other children, all the other families who experienced that same humiliation while I was completely oblivious. Amelia settled into the chair across from his desk, studying the list of names and phone numbers. These are all the families from Tyler's list. The ones Sarah and Marcus could identify with contact information. There are probably more. People who experienced discrimination but never formally complained. People whose names Tyler didn't bother to write down. David ran his hands over his face. Amelia, what if I can't fix this? What if the damage is too deep? Before she could answer, small footsteps padded down the hallway, and Zoe appeared in the doorway wearing her favorite pajamas, the ones with little astronauts floating among stars. Daddy? Are you making phone calls to the mean people? David's heart clenched. Even after sleeping, even after Amelia had spent an hour last night explaining what had happened in age-appropriate terms, Zoe still carried the weight of yesterday's experience in her young mind. No, sweetheart. I'm calling the people who were hurt by the mean people. I'm going to tell them I'm sorry and ask them to give Daddy's restaurant another chance. Zoe climbed onto his lap, nestling against his chest. Will they forgive you? I don't know, baby girl. But I have to try. David's phone rang before he could make his first call. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer. Mr. Coleman? This is James Washington. I was at your restaurant last night. David's mind raced, trying to place the name and face. Mr. Washington, I'm sorry, but could you remind me? I was sitting 3 tables away from you when that server poured water on your daughter. The memory clicked into place. James Washington was a well-dressed black man in his 50s who had been dining alone, quietly working on his laptop while eating. David remembered seeing him during the confrontation, but in the chaos, he hadn't thought to approach him. Mr. Washington, I'm so sorry you had to witness that. If there's anything I can do. Actually, Mr. Coleman, that's why I'm calling. I wanted you to know that what happened to your family yesterday, it wasn't the first time. David felt his stomach drop. What do you mean? I've been coming to Bella Vista for about 4 months. I'm a freelance journalist, and I like to work in restaurant environments. The ambient noise helps me concentrate. But I've noticed things. Patterns in how certain customers are treated versus others. James's voice was calm, professional, but David could hear the underlying anger. I've been seated in that same back corner 5 times out of the 6 times I visited. I've watched black families wait longer for tables, while white families with later reservations are seated immediately. I've seen servers roll their eyes when approached by customers of color, heard them make comments they thought no one was listening to. Mr. Washington, why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you complain to management? There was a bitter laugh on the other end of the line. Mr. Coleman, I'm 53 years old. I've been dealing with this kind of treatment my entire adult life. After a while, you learn to pick your battles. You learn that complaining often just makes things worse, that you'll be labeled as difficult, or playing the race card. So you just stop going to places that don't want you. The words hit David like a physical blow. How many customers had he lost without even knowing it? How many people had simply decided that Bella Vista wasn't for them based on the treatment they'd received? But yesterday, James continued, when I saw what that young man did to your little girl, when I saw the shock and confusion in her eyes, I realized that staying silent wasn't protecting anyone. It was just enabling the problem to continue. David held Zoe a little tighter. Mr. Washington, would you be willing to meet with me? I'm trying to understand the full scope of what's been happening, and I could use your perspective. I'll do better than that, Mr. Coleman. I'm going to write about it. David felt his blood pressure spike. Write about it? You mean, publicly? I freelance for several publications, including the Metro Weekly and City Magazine. What happened at your restaurant yesterday is a perfect example of how systemic racism operates in everyday spaces. People need to understand that this isn't just about individual prejudice, it's about institutional failures that allow discrimination to flourish. David's mind raced through the implications. A negative article in major local publications could destroy Bella Vista completely. The restaurant industry was unforgiving, and once a reputation was damaged, it was nearly impossible to recover. Mr. Washington, David said carefully, I understand your anger, and you have every right to tell your story. But I'm asking you to consider giving me a chance to make this right before you go public. I'm not asking you to stay silent, I'm asking you to help me fix this. There was a long pause. What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Coleman? I'm proposing that you document the changes I'm making. That you watch as I rebuild this restaurant from the ground up, as I create the kind of inclusive environment I should have maintained from the beginning. If I fail, if I don't follow through, then you write whatever story you think needs to be told. But if I succeed, if you succeed, then you write a story about redemption. About what it looks like when someone acknowledges their failures and actually does the work to fix them. Another long pause. That's an interesting proposition. But Mr. Coleman, you should know that I won't be the only one watching. Yesterday's incident was filmed by several customers. Videos of that young man's racist rant are already circulating on social media. Your restaurant is about to become very famous for all the wrong reasons. David closed his eyes. In the age of smartphones and social media, he should have realized that Tyler's breakdown had been recorded. By now, the videos were probably spreading across platforms, being shared and reshared, generating the kind of viral outrage that could destroy a business overnight. How bad is it? David asked quietly. Bad. The hashtag Bella Vista racism is trending locally. People are calling for boycotts, demanding that you close the restaurant permanently. But there's also something else happening. What? There are people defending you. Customers who witnessed your response, who heard you fire Tyler immediately, who saw how you handled the situation. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who spoke to your daughter, she posted a long Facebook message about your character and your response. It's being shared widely. David felt a small spark of hope. So public opinion is divided? Public opinion is forming, Mr. Coleman. And you have maybe 48 hours to shape that narrative before it hardens into something permanent. The question is, what story do you want to tell? After James Washington hung up with a promise to meet later that afternoon, David sat in his office, staring at the list of phone numbers while his daughter played quietly at his feet and his wife watched him with concern. The first call is always the hardest, Amelia said gently. After that, it gets a little easier. David picked up the phone and dialed the first number on the list. Hello, is this Mrs. Johnson? This is David Coleman from Bella Vista Restaurant. I'm calling because I owe you an apology. The conversation with Mrs. Johnson lasted 23 minutes. She was a kindergarten teacher in her 30s who had brought her elderly mother to Bella Vista for her birthday 3 months ago. They had been kept waiting for over an hour despite having a reservation, then seated at a table where the air conditioning was broken on a 90-degree day. When they complained, Tyler had been dismissive and rude, suggesting that perhaps they would be more comfortable at a more casual establishment. Mrs. Johnson listened to David's apology with skeptical silence, asked pointed questions about what he planned to do differently, and finally agreed to consider returning once he had implemented concrete changes. Mr. Coleman, she said before hanging up, I appreciate you calling. Most business owners would have just hoped this whole thing would blow over. But you should know that trust isn't just rebuilt with phone calls. It's rebuilt with actions. The second call was to the Williams family, a couple with 3 young children who had been celebrating their wedding anniversary. They had received such poor service that they left before ordering entrees, with Tyler making loud comments about people who can't afford to eat here anyway as they walked out. Mr. Williams was angrier than Mrs. Johnson, his voice tight with years of accumulated frustration. You want to know what bothers me most, Mr. Coleman? It's not just that we were treated badly. It's that our kids saw it happen. Our 7-year-old son asked us on the way home why the waiter didn't like us. How do you explain that to a child? By the 4th call, David had developed a rhythm, but each conversation was unique in its pain. There was the young professional who had brought clients to Bella Vista, only to be embarrassed by obviously inferior service. The elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary, who had been made to feel unwelcome in what should have been a joyous moment. The college student who had saved up for months to take his girlfriend somewhere special, only to be treated with condescension and disrespect. Each story added another layer to David's understanding of how profoundly his restaurant had failed. But something else was happening too. A strange kind of connection was forming with these strangers who had been hurt in his establishment. They were sharing their stories with him, trusting him with their pain, giving him a chance to acknowledge their experiences. By noon, David had made 11 calls. 7 people had agreed to consider giving Bella Vista another chance, contingent on seeing real changes. 3 had politely but firmly declined, saying the damage was too deep to repair. 1 had hung up on him after calling him a series of names that made David grateful Zoe was no longer in the room. As he prepared to make the 12th call, his phone rang again. This time, the caller ID showed a number he recognized. Marcus, calling from the restaurant. David, we have a problem. There are protesters outside. David felt his heart sink. How many? About 30 people with signs. They're chanting, demanding that we close permanently. But David, there's something else. There are counter-protesters too. People supporting the restaurant, saying you did the right thing by firing Tyler. It's getting tense out here. David closed his eyes and tried to think. His restaurant was becoming the center of a racial controversy that could spiral out of control if he didn't handle it carefully. Marcus, I'm coming in. Don't let anyone inside the building without my authorization, and if things get violent, call the police immediately. There's more, David. Channel 7 News is here. They want to interview you about what happened yesterday and about your plans moving forward. A news interview. The story was about to go regional, maybe national. Every word he said would be scrutinized. Every decision he made would be analyzed. This was no longer just about fixing his restaurant. This was about taking a public stand on issues of race, discrimination, and redemption. Tell them I'll give them a statement in 1 hour, David said. And Marcus? Call Sarah Chun and ask her to come in early. I'm going to need all the help I can get. As he hung up the phone, David realized that the most difficult part of this whole ordeal was just beginning. The phone calls to apologize were hard, but at least they were private conversations where he could speak from his heart. Now he would have to face cameras, reporters, and an increasingly polarized public who would judge his every word and action. The real test of his character was about to begin. The scene outside Bella Vista looked like something from a civil rights documentary. Two distinct groups had formed on opposite sides of the street, separated by police barriers and a growing crowd of onlookers. On one side, protesters held signs reading "Racist Restaurant," "Shut down Bella Vista," and "Black children deserve dignity." On the other side, counter-protesters displayed messages like "David Coleman did the right thing," "One bad employee is not equal to bad owner," and "Support accountability." David sat in his car at the end of the block, watching the chaos through his windshield. News vans from 3 different stations lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray sky like mechanical flowers. Reporters practiced their segments while camera crews tested equipment, all preparing to broadcast his crisis to the world. His phone had been ringing non-stop. Calls from other restaurant owners offering support, messages from civil rights organizations wanting statements, requests for interviews from journalists as far away as Atlanta and Chicago. The story had gone viral overnight, fueled by the cell phone videos of Tyler's racist rant and the powerful image of 8-year-old Zoe sitting in her father's oversized suit jacket, looking small and confused. But it was the text message from his daughter that gave him the strength to get out of the car. "Daddy, I saw you on TV. You looked sad. I drew you a picture to make you feel better. It's a rainbow family eating at a happy restaurant. Love, Zoe." As David approached the restaurant, a young black woman broke away from the protest line and intercepted him. She was maybe 25, well-dressed, with natural hair and intelligent eyes that blazed with righteous anger. "Mr. Coleman. Mr. Coleman, please wait." David stopped, recognizing something in her voice that made him listen despite the chaos around them. "My name is Keisha Turner," she said, slightly breathless from running across the street. "I'm with the Coalition for Economic Justice. We organize boycotts of businesses that discriminate against communities of color." David's heart sank. An organized boycott could destroy Bella Vista permanently, regardless of what changes he made. "Ms. Turner, I understand you're angry, and you have every right to be. What happened in my restaurant was inexcusable, but I'm asking you to give me a chance to." "Mr. Coleman," she interrupted, "I'm not here to threaten you with a boycott. I'm here to offer you something else." David blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry." "Partnership. Accountability. A way to turn this crisis into something meaningful." Keisha's voice carried the passion of someone who had spent years fighting these battles. "Look, we could destroy your restaurant. We have the power to do that, and frankly, a lot of people want us to. But destroying one restaurant doesn't change anything. It doesn't address the systemic issues that allowed this to happen." She gestured toward the protesters, many of whom were watching their conversation intently. These people aren't just angry about Tyler Morrison. They're angry about every time they've been made to feel unwelcome, every restaurant that's treated them as less than human, every business owner who looked the other way when discrimination happened on their watch. "So what are you proposing?" David asked. "I'm proposing that you become an example of how to do this right. That you work with us to implement real changes, not just sensitivity training and diversity posters, but meaningful structural reforms. That you make Bella Vista a model for how businesses can acknowledge their failures and build something better." David studied this young woman who could either save or destroy his business. "And in exchange?" "In exchange, we help you tell a story of redemption instead of destruction. We work with you instead of against you." "But Mr. Coleman," her voice hardened, "this isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. If you agree to this, you're committing to real change. Transparent change. Change that can be measured and verified. If you fail, if this turns out to be just public relations theater, we'll make sure everyone knows." Before David could respond, a reporter from Channel 7 approached with her camera crew. "Mr. Coleman? I'm Janet Rodriguez. Are you ready for that interview?" David looked at Keisha, then at the crowd, then at his restaurant, the beautiful building that had become the center of a storm he never could have imagined. "Give me 5 more minutes," he told the reporter. David pulled out his phone and called Sarah Chun, who answered on the first ring. "Sarah, I need you to be completely honest with me. If you were in charge of rebuilding this restaurant, what would you do differently?" "Everything," Sarah said without hesitation. "I'd change the hiring process to include bias training and cultural competency assessments. I'd implement a customer feedback system that specifically tracks experiences by demographic groups. I'd create a reporting system for staff to flag discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation. I'd establish partnerships with community organizations to ensure ongoing accountability." How long would all of that take? To implement properly? 6 months. Maybe more. David looked at the crowds, the cameras, the reporters waiting for his statement. 6 months was a lifetime in the news cycle, but it was nothing when it came to rebuilding trust. "Sarah, how would you feel about becoming the general manager of Bella Vista?" There was silence on the other end of the line. "What about Marcus?" Marcus failed in his responsibilities. He allowed a culture of discrimination to flourish under his watch. That's not something I can overlook, regardless of his intentions. David, I would be honored. But are you sure you want to make that kind of decision right now, in the middle of all this? David looked at Keisha Turner, who was still standing nearby, clearly listening to his side of the conversation. "Sarah, sometimes the middle of a crisis is exactly when you need to make your most important decisions. Can you be here in an hour?" "I'm already on my way." David hung up and turned back to Keisha. "Ms. Turner, I accept your proposal. But I want to add something to it." "What?" "I want you to join the process. Not as an outside monitor, but as a partner. I want to offer you a position on an advisory board that will oversee the changes at Bella Vista. Full access to our operations, our hiring practices, our customer feedback. Real power to hold us accountable." Keisha's eyes widened slightly. "Mr. Coleman, you realize that would mean giving critics of your business actual authority over how you run it?" "Yes. And I realize it might be the only way to prove that I'm serious about change." The interview with Janet Rodriguez lasted 12 minutes and felt like 12 hours. David stood in front of his restaurant, with protesters and supporters visible in the background, cameras rolling as he tried to find words for one of the most important speeches of his life. "Mr. Coleman," Rodriguez began yesterday, A server at your restaurant poured water on an 8-year-old black child and made racist comments to your family. How do you respond to people who say this incident reflects the culture you've created at Bella Vista? David took a deep breath. Janet, they're absolutely right. Not about my intentions, but about my failures. I built this restaurant to be a place of welcome and community, but I failed to ensure that vision was actually realized. I failed to properly oversee my staff, failed to recognize signs of discrimination, and failed to protect customers who deserved better. Some people are calling for you to close the restaurant permanently. Do you think that's appropriate? I think that would be the easy way out, David said, aware that his answer might surprise people. Closing the restaurant would end the controversy, but it wouldn't fix the problem. It wouldn't help other businesses avoid making the same mistakes I made. It wouldn't create any positive change in our community. Rodriguez pressed on. But how can you expect families of color to trust your establishment after what happened? I can't expect them to trust us. Trust has to be earned, and we lost the right to expect it the moment we allowed discrimination to happen under our roof. What I can do is commit to earning the trust back through concrete actions, not just words. David outlined his partnership with Keisha Turner's organization, the promotion of Sarah Chun to general manager, the comprehensive review of all restaurant policies and practices. He announced that Bella Vista would close for 1 week to implement initial changes and retrain all staff, then reopen with new systems in place. Mr. Coleman, Rodriguez asked in closing, what would you say to your daughter about what happened yesterday? For the first time during the interview, David's composure cracked slightly. I would tell her that sometimes adults make terrible mistakes, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to do better. I would tell her that her dignity and worth are not determined by how other people treat her, but that doesn't mean we should accept being treated badly. And I would tell her that out of something very painful, we're going to try to build something beautiful. As the cameras stopped rolling, David noticed that the crowd dynamics had shifted. The two opposing groups were still present, but some people from both sides were crossing the street, engaging in conversations rather than chants. The police barriers remained, but the tension had decreased noticeably. Keisha Turner approached him as the news crew packed up their equipment. That was a good start, she said. But Mr. Coleman, you should know that a lot of people in the community are going to be watching to see if your actions match your words. Public apologies are easy. Real change is hard. I understand. And Keisha? I meant what I said about the advisory board. I'd like you to consider chairing it. She studied his face for a long moment. I'll consider it. But first, I want to meet with your staff. I want to hear from the people who have to implement these changes about whether they think you're serious or just trying to save your business. As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah Chun arrived, moving through the crowd with the confident stride of someone who had made a decision and was ready to act on it. David, she said, slightly breathless, I've been thinking about your offer, and I accept. But I have conditions. What kind of conditions? I want complete authority over hiring and firing. I want a budget for comprehensive staff training. I want the ability to refuse service to any customer who treats our staff disrespectfully, regardless of their race or spending power. And I want your commitment that if I identify problems, you'll support the solutions even if they're expensive or controversial. David looked at this young woman who was volunteering to take on one of the most challenging management positions in the city, who was willing to rebuild a restaurant's culture from the ground up under intense public scrutiny. Done, he said without hesitation. As the crowd began to disperse and the news crews prepared for their evening broadcasts, David allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. The hardest conversations were still ahead, with his remaining staff, with the families he had failed to protect, with a community that had every right to be skeptical of his promises. But for the first time since Tyler Morrison had poured that water on his daughter's head, David felt like he might actually be able to build something better from the wreckage of what had been. The real work was just beginning, but at least now he wasn't facing it alone. 1 week later, Bella Vista sat empty and silent, its elegant dining room transformed into something resembling a corporate conference center. Tables had been pushed aside to make room for folding chairs arranged in a large circle. Flip chart paper covered the walls, filled with notes about new policies, training modules, and accountability measures. The beautiful restaurant David had spent months perfecting now looked like a construction site for something entirely new. Sarah Chun stood at the front of the room, addressing the remaining staff, 12 employees out of the original 23. The others had either been terminated for participating in discriminatory practices or had quit rather than undergo the intensive retraining process David and Sarah had designed. "I know this is uncomfortable," Sarah said, looking at the faces around her. Some appeared genuinely engaged, others seemed resentful or skeptical, and a few looked outright hostile. "I know some of you are angry about the changes, angry about colleagues who were fired, angry about having to examine your own behavior and assumptions. That's normal, and it's okay to feel that way." Kevin Martinez, one of the evening servers who had survived the purge despite making questionable comments about diversity hires, raised his hand. "Sarah, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you really think we're all racists? Because that's what this feels like we're all being punished because Tyler went crazy and did something stupid." The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah had been expecting it, but that didn't make it any easier to address. "Kevin, let me ask you something back. In the 6 months you've worked here, how many times did you see Tyler or other staff members treat black customers differently than white customers?" Kevin shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. Maybe a few times, but I didn't think it was. I mean, some customers are just more difficult than others." "And did you notice any patterns in which customers were considered difficult?" The room was completely quiet. Kevin's face flushed as the implication of the question sank in. "Look," he said defensively, "I'm not a racist. I've got black friends. I voted for Obama twice. I just did my job and minded my own business." Before Sarah could respond, the restaurant's front door opened and Keisha Turner entered, followed by 3 other people David didn't recognize. The new arrivals moved with the confident purpose of individuals who belonged there, which surprised some of the staff who clearly hadn't expected community activists to have access to their training session. "I hope you don't mind the interruption," Keisha said, addressing Sarah directly. "I wanted to introduce the rest of the advisory board to the team." Sarah nodded. This had been planned, but they hadn't told the staff exactly when it would happen. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet the people who will be working with us over the next 6 months to rebuild Bella Vista's culture. Keisha Turner, who you've probably seen on the news, will be chairing our Community Accountability Board. Dr. Amara Okafor is a professor of organizational psychology at the university who specializes in workplace bias. Marcus Williams, no relation to our former manager, is a restaurant industry consultant who has helped other establishments address discrimination issues. And Janet Chun, my older sister actually, is a civil rights attorney who will be advising us on legal compliance and best practices. The staff absorbed this information with varying degrees of shock and dismay. Several employees exchanged glances that clearly communicated their discomfort with having outsiders monitor their every move. "I know some of you are wondering why we need all this oversight," David said, speaking for the first time since the session began. He had been sitting quietly in the circle, deliberately positioning himself as a participant rather than the authority figure. "You're wondering why we can't just fire the bad actors and move on." Beth Williams, a server from the morning shift, nodded. "Honestly, Mr. Coleman, yes. I mean, we got rid of Tyler and the others who were actually doing bad things. Why can't we just start fresh?" David stood up and walked to one of the flipped chart papers on the wall, the one titled, Systemic Failures. Beth, let me show you something. This is a timeline of every discriminatory incident we've been able to document over the past 6 months. He pointed to a series of dates and brief descriptions. Now, look at this carefully. These incidents didn't happen randomly. They follow patterns. The staff leaned forward to examine the timeline more closely. Tuesday and Wednesday evenings, Tyler's shifts, show the highest concentration of problems. But they also show something else. They show that other staff members were present, other servers were working, other managers were on duty. Yet not one person reported what was happening. David moved to another sheet of paper. This chart shows our customer demographics over the same period. Notice anything? Sarah picked up the explanation. We saw a 34% decrease in black customers over 6 months, while our overall customer base only grew by 8%. We were systematically driving away an entire demographic group, and nobody noticed. Kevin raised his hand again. But that could be for lots of reasons. Maybe black people just prefer different types of restaurants, or... Kevin, Dr. Okafor interrupted gently, that's exactly the kind of assumption we need to examine. When you see data showing that people of a specific race are avoiding a business, your first thought shouldn't be about their preferences. It should be about whether that business is welcoming to them. The room fell silent as the implications of this sank in. Marcus Williams, the consultant, not their former manager, stood up and addressed the group. I want to share something with all of you. I've been working in this industry for 15 years, helping restaurants address discrimination issues. And I can tell you that what happened at Bella Vista isn't unique. It's not even unusual. He paused, letting that statement settle. The restaurant industry has a systemic problem with discrimination. Black customers report negative experiences at significantly higher rates than white customers. Black employees face workplace harassment at alarming levels. And black restaurant owners, like Mr. Coleman here, often find that their own staff don't respect their authority. David felt exposed by this observation, but he knew it needed to be said. The reason we need all this oversight, all this training, all these new policies, is because individual good intentions aren't enough. You can be a good person with no conscious racial bias and still participate in discriminatory systems. You can be genuinely kind and still perpetuate harm through inaction. Beth raised her hand tentatively. So what you're saying is that even if I never personally treated anyone badly, I'm still part of the problem if I saw it happening and didn't stop it? That's exactly what I'm saying, Marcus replied. And more than that, if you worked in an environment where discrimination was happening and you never noticed it, that suggests you might have some unconscious biases that prevented you from seeing the problem. The discomfort in the room was palpable now. Several staff members were shifting in their seats, looking defensive or upset. This is bullshit, said Tom Patterson, the sous chef who had made disparaging comments about David's qualifications. You're basically saying that everything we do, everything we think, everything we notice or don't notice is racist. How are we supposed to work in that kind of environment? David had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come. Tom Patterson represented the kind of employee who could either evolve or poison the entire effort to change the restaurant's culture. Tom, David said quietly, tell me something. In your professional opinion, am I qualified to run this restaurant? Tom's face flushed. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I asked. Do you think I have the culinary knowledge, business experience, and industry expertise to successfully operate Bella Vista? The room was dead silent. Everyone knew that Tom had questioned David's qualifications behind his back, but no one had expected the confrontation to happen so directly. Mr. Coleman, I think you're a successful businessman, and... That's not what I asked, Tom. I asked if you think I'm qualified to run this restaurant. It's a simple question. Tom looked around the room as if seeking an escape route. Look, I never said you weren't qualified. I just thought. I mean, some of the menu decisions seemed. Seemed what, Tom? Seemed like maybe you were copying ideas from other places instead of developing original concepts. David nodded slowly. Tom, I have a degree in hospitality management from Cornell. I worked in restaurant kitchens for 8 years before going into business. I've eaten at over 300 restaurants across the country studying menu development and flavor profiles. I speak Italian and spent 6 months in Italy learning regional cooking techniques. The menu at Bella Vista represents 5 years of research and development. Tom's face had gone pale. I didn't know all that. Of course you didn't. Because you never asked about my background. You never showed any interest in learning from me or working with me. You just assumed that a black man couldn't possibly have earned this position through merit. The words hung in the air like an accusation, which they were. Now, Tom, here's your choice. You can acknowledge that your assumptions were wrong, commit to examining your unconscious biases, and work with us to build something better. Or you can continue believing that you're the victim of some kind of reverse discrimination, in which case you should probably look for another job. Tom stared at the floor for a long moment. When he finally looked up, there were tears in his eyes. Mr. Coleman, I think I owe you an apology. And I think I owe myself some honest self-reflection. David felt a knot in his chest loosen slightly. Tom, that's all I'm asking from anyone. The willingness to examine our assumptions and commit to doing better. Keisha Turner, who had been observing the entire exchange, spoke for the first time since entering the room. This is why the advisory board exists, she said. Not to punish anyone, not to make anyone feel bad about themselves, but to create accountability for real change. Because here's the thing, good intentions aren't enough. Tyler Morrison probably thought he had good intentions when he targeted black customers. He probably told himself he was just maintaining standards or protecting the restaurant's reputation. She stood up and walked to the center of the circle. Real change requires acknowledging that our individual perspectives are limited. It requires accepting feedback from people whose experiences are different from our own. And it requires committing to systems and processes that prevent discrimination, even when we're tired, even when we're busy, even when it's inconvenient. Dr. Okafor added, what we're asking you to do over the next 6 months isn't just learn new policies or attend sensitivity training. We're asking you to develop cultural competency, the ability to recognize when your own cultural background might be creating blind spots in how you interact with customers and colleagues. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of the staff, some engaged, some resistant, some still processing everything they'd heard. I know this is overwhelming, she said. I know some of you are angry, some of you are scared, and some of you are wondering if it's worth staying. But I want you to understand something. We're not trying to fix what's wrong with you as individuals. We're trying to fix what's wrong with the systems and culture that allowed discrimination to flourish. David stood up and addressed the group one final time. Tomorrow, we reopen. We'll have customers watching us, critics monitoring us, and community members expecting us to live up to our promises. Some of those customers will be families who were hurt in this restaurant. Some will be people who are skeptical about whether we've really changed. All of them deserve our absolute best. He paused, looking at each staff member individually. If you're not ready to be part of that effort, if you can't commit to treating every customer with dignity and respect regardless of their race, their appearance, or their perceived economic status, then please don't come in tomorrow. But if you are ready, If you want to be part of building something better than what existed before, then I promise you'll have my full support." As the training session ended and staff members filed out in small groups, discussing what they'd heard, David felt cautiously optimistic. The real test would come tomorrow when they reopened their doors to a community that had every reason to be skeptical. But for the first time in a week, David believed they might actually succeed. Tuesday morning arrived crisp and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the windows of Bella Vista as David stood in the empty dining room at 6 a.m., watching his staff prepare for what would either be a triumphant reopening or a spectacular failure. The restaurant looked exactly as it had a week ago, same elegant decor, same carefully chosen artwork, same warm lighting, but everything felt different. Sarah moved through the space with quiet confidence, checking table settings and speaking softly with servers. The new training had transformed more than just policies. It had changed the very energy of the place. Staff members who had seemed defensive and resentful just days earlier now moved with purpose, their interactions with each other more thoughtful and respectful. At 6:30 a.m., the first test arrived. Mrs. Johnson, the kindergarten teacher whose birthday celebration with her elderly mother had been ruined by Tyler's discrimination, stood outside the front door with her husband and 2 young children. David had called her personally 3 days ago, not to pressure her but simply to let her know they were reopening and to apologize again for what she had experienced. David walked to the door himself and opened it, his heart pounding. "Mrs. Johnson," he said quietly, "thank you for coming. Thank you for giving us another chance." She studied his face carefully. "Mr. Coleman, I'm not here to give you another chance. I'm here to see if you've actually changed anything or if this is just good public relations." Her directness was exactly what David had expected and exactly what he respected. "I understand. And I hope we can show you through our actions that we've earned the right to serve you and your family." As David led the Johnson family to their table, a prime spot by the window with plenty of natural light, he noticed a familiar figure sitting alone at the bar. James Washington, the freelance journalist who had called him after witnessing the incident with Zoe, was nursing a cup of coffee and typing on his laptop. Their eyes met across the restaurant, and James nodded almost imperceptibly. He was here to document the reopening, to see if David's promises would translate into actual change. The morning progressed quietly. A handful of customers trickled in, some who had been loyal patrons before the incident, others who seemed to be curiosity seekers drawn by the media coverage. David noticed that Sarah was personally greeting every table, checking on service levels, and making sure each customer felt genuinely welcomed. At 10:30 a.m., the second test arrived, and this one nearly stopped David's heart. Tyler Morrison walked through the front door. He looked terrible, thin, unshaven, his clothes wrinkled as if he'd slept in them. His eyes were red-rimmed and desperate, and he moved with the uncertain steps of someone who wasn't sure he should be there. Sarah immediately moved to intercept him, her body language protective and alert. "Tyler, you need to leave. Now." "Please," Tyler's voice cracked. "I just need to talk to Mr. Coleman. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking." David found himself walking toward the confrontation before he'd consciously decided to do so. Every instinct told him to have Tyler escorted out immediately, but something in the young man's expression, not defiance or anger, but what looked like genuine desperation, made him pause. "Tyler," David said carefully, "what are you doing here?" "I haven't slept in 3 days," Tyler said, his words tumbling over each other. "I keep thinking about that little girl, about her face when I poured the water on her. I keep thinking about what I said, about who I became in that moment." The restaurant had gone quiet. Mrs. Johnson and her family were watching intently, as was James Washington. David was acutely aware that how he handled this moment would be scrutinized and judged. "Tyler, if you're here to ask for your job back." "I'm not," Tyler interrupted. "I know that's not possible. I know I don't deserve that. I'm here to. I don't know what I'm here for. To apologize, maybe. To try to understand how I became someone who could hurt a child. David looked at this broken young man who had caused so much pain, who had forced his daughter to confront hatred at age 8, who had nearly destroyed everything David had worked to build. And then he made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Sit down," David said quietly, gesturing to a table in the corner. 5 minutes. Sarah's eyes widened in alarm, but David gave her a slight nod that said, "Trust me." As they sat across from each other, Tyler began to speak in a rush, as if he'd been rehearsing these words. "Mr. Coleman, I've been staying with my cousin in Richmond, and she made me watch every news story about what happened. Made me see the interviews with your daughter, the videos of you apologizing to families, the protesters outside your restaurant. She kept asking me the same question, how did you become this person?" Tyler's hands were shaking as he continued. "And the thing is, I don't know. I mean, I do know, but I don't understand how it happened. I grew up hearing certain things about certain people, and I never questioned them. When things got hard in my life, when I couldn't find work or when I felt left behind, it was easier to blame other people than to look at my own choices." David listened without speaking, his expression neutral but attentive. "I want you to know that I've been going to counseling. I found a therapist who specializes in people like me. People who've let hate poison their thinking. And she's been helping me understand that what I did to your daughter wasn't just about racism. It was about my own self-hatred, my own sense of failure, my own fear that I wasn't good enough." Tyler paused, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "But none of that excuses what I did. None of that makes it okay that I hurt an innocent child because of my own problems." David finally spoke. "Tyler, what do you want from me?" "I want to know how to be different. I want to know how someone changes from being the kind of person who pours water on a child to being the kind of person who deserves to exist in the world. Because right now, I don't think I deserve that." The conversation was interrupted by a small voice from across the restaurant. "Daddy, is that the mean man?" David turned to see Amelia and Zoe entering the restaurant. He had asked them to come for lunch, wanting Zoe to see the restaurant as a safe, welcoming place again. But he hadn't expected Tyler to be here, and now his 8-year-old daughter was face to face with the person who had traumatized her just over a week ago. Tyler's face went white as he saw Zoe. He started to stand, clearly intending to leave immediately, but Zoe's next words stopped him. "Mommy, why does he look so sad?" Amelia's protective instincts kicked in immediately. She moved to position herself between Zoe and Tyler, her expression fierce. But Zoe stepped around her mother and walked directly toward their table. "Zoe, no," David said gently, but she ignored him. She stopped 3 feet from Tyler and studied his face with the intense curiosity that only children possess. "Are you sorry you were mean to me?" she asked simply. Tyler's composure completely collapsed. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at the small girl who had shown him more grace than he had ever shown anyone. "Yes," he whispered. "I'm sorrier than I've ever been about anything in my whole life." Zoe considered this. "My daddy says that when people do bad things, it's usually because they're hurting inside. Are you hurting inside?" "Yes," Tyler managed. "Very much. My daddy also says that when people are really truly sorry, we should try to forgive them, even when it's hard. But I don't know if I can forgive you yet. Maybe someday." She turned to David. "Daddy, can the mean man learn to be nice?" David felt every eye in the restaurant on him. Mrs. Johnson and her family, James Washington with his laptop ready to document whatever happened next, Sarah and the staff watching to see how their owner would handle this impossible moment. "I don't know, sweetheart," David said honestly. but I think maybe he's trying to learn. Zoe nodded solemnly, then looked back at Tyler. My teacher says that trying is the most important part. So maybe you should keep trying. With that, she walked back to her mother, leaving Tyler sitting at the table, sobbing openly. David stood up. Tyler, I need you to leave now. But... He paused, thinking about his daughter's words, about redemption, about the possibility of change. If you're serious about getting help, if you're really committed to becoming a different person, then maybe in a few months we can talk again. Tyler nodded, unable to speak. He stood on shaky legs and walked toward the door, but stopped and turned back one final time. Mr. Coleman, he said, his voice barely audible, your daughter she's an amazing person. You should be very proud. I am, David replied simply. As Tyler left the restaurant, the atmosphere slowly returned to normal. Conversations resumed, silverware clinked against plates, and the world continued turning. But David knew that something important had just happened, not just Tyler's apparent transformation, but his own daughter's demonstration of a kind of grace that most adults never achieve. Mrs. Johnson approached their table as David was helping Zoe into her booster seat. Mr. Coleman, she said quietly, I want you to know that I've been watching everything that just happened. The way your staff treated my family today, the way you handled that young man, the way you're raising your daughter. I think you really have changed things here. She paused, then continued with a smile. We'll be back. And we'll be bringing friends. James Washington appeared at David's shoulder as Mrs. Johnson returned to her table. That was quite a moment, the journalist said. Mind if I ask you a question? Go ahead. Do you really believe people like Tyler Morrison can change? Do you think redemption is possible for someone who demonstrated that level of hatred? David looked across the restaurant at his daughter, who was now coloring on her placemat while chatting happily with Amelia. Then he looked at Sarah, confidently managing a dining room that had been transformed from a place of discrimination into something that felt genuinely welcoming. James, David said finally, I think redemption is possible for anyone who's willing to do the hard work of becoming better. But I also think it's not my job to offer redemption to people who've hurt my family. My job is to build something good and let other people decide if they want to be part of it. And if Tyler Morrison does the work? If he really changes? David considered this. Then maybe someday my daughter will decide she can forgive him. But that's her choice to make, not mine. As the lunch service continued and the restaurant filled with customers who seemed genuinely happy to be there, David felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks: peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of something positive being built from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. Bella Vista wasn't just reopening. It was being reborn. What do you think about Zoe's response to Tyler? Should children be expected to show such grace to people who have hurt them, or was this a powerful moment of healing? And do you believe Tyler's transformation is genuine? Share your thoughts below. This story is ultimately about whether people can truly change. 6 months later, Bella Vista hummed with the quiet energy of a restaurant that had found its rhythm. The Saturday evening crowd was diverse and animated, families celebrating birthdays, couples on dates, business associates closing deals, friends catching up over wine. The demographic shift was striking compared to 6 months earlier. Roughly 40% of the customers were people of color, compared to less than 15% before the incident with Tyler. David stood in the kitchen doorway, watching Sarah orchestrate the dinner service with the confidence of someone who had truly grown into her role. She moved between tables with easy professionalism, checking on customers, consulting with servers, solving small problems before they became larger ones. Under her management, Bella Vista had not just recovered from the crisis, it had thrived. The transformation hadn't been easy. 3 more staff members had quit during the intensive 6-month retraining program, unable or unwilling to adapt to the new culture of accountability and inclusion. But those who remained had become something special, a team that genuinely cared about creating positive experiences for every customer who walked through the door. "Mr. Coleman?" A familiar voice interrupted David's observations. He turned to see James Washington approaching, no longer the solitary diner with a laptop, but now a regular customer who often brought friends and colleagues to experience what he called the most thoughtfully managed restaurant in the city. "James, good to see you. How's the book coming along?" James grinned. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. My publisher wants to feature Bella Vista as the final chapter, the story of how one restaurant transformed a crisis into positive change. But I wanted your permission first." David considered this. 6 months ago, the idea of being featured in a book about restaurant discrimination would have terrified him. Now, he felt ready to share their story, including all its painful and difficult moments. "What's the angle? What story do you want to tell?" "The story of institutional change," James replied. "Not just individual redemption, but systemic transformation. How organizations can acknowledge their failures and build something better." Before David could respond, Keisha Turner appeared at his side. As chair of the Community Accountability Board, she had become a regular presence at Bella Vista, monitoring progress and providing ongoing guidance. More than that, she had become something David hadn't expected, a friend and trusted advisor. "James, are you trying to convince David to go national with this story?" she asked with a smile. "Guilty as charged. But Keisha, you have to admit, what you've built here is remarkable. The incident reporting system, the community partnership model, the ongoing bias training. Other restaurants are already asking how they can implement similar programs." Keisha's expression grew more serious. "Actually, David, that's something we need to discuss. I've been contacted by restaurant owners in Atlanta, Chicago, and Los Angeles. They're all dealing with discrimination issues and want to know if our advisory board model can be replicated in their cities." David felt a familiar mixture of pride and overwhelm. "Are you talking about franchising our approach to fighting racism?" "I'm talking about creating a national movement," Keisha replied. "Taking what we've learned here and scaling it to help other businesses address systemic discrimination before it reaches crisis levels." The conversation was interrupted by a server approaching with a concerned expression. "Mr. Coleman? There's a situation at table 12 that you might want to handle personally." David's heart rate immediately increased. Despite all their progress, despite all their training, the specter of another discriminatory incident still haunted him. "What's the issue?" It's complicated. There's a white family at table 12 who's complaining about receiving what they call reverse discrimination. They claim they were given inferior service because the table next to them, a black family, received what they perceive as better treatment. David closed his eyes and took a deep breath. This was the kind of situation they had trained for but hoped never to encounter. "Where's Sarah?" "Already at the table, but the customers are demanding to speak with the owner." As David walked toward table 12, he reflected on how much his perspective had changed over the past 6 months. Initially, he would have approached such a situation with pure anxiety, desperate to avoid any conflict that might damage the restaurant's reputation. Now he felt something different, calm resolve to handle the situation fairly and professionally, regardless of the customer's race or their complaints. The family at table 12 consisted of 2 parents and 2 teenagers, all clearly agitated. The father, a well-dressed man in his 50s, stood up as David approached. "Are you the owner? Because I need to tell you that your staff is discriminating against white customers. We've been waiting 20 minutes for our appetizers while that table," he pointed to a black family with young children, "got their food first even though they were seated after us." David looked at Sarah, who gave him a subtle nod that confirmed she had already investigated the complaint. Then he turned back to the family with the calm professionalism that had become his signature approach to difficult situations. "Sir, I understand your concern, and I want to make sure we address it properly. My manager has explained the situation to you, but let me make sure I understand your complaint correctly. You believe you received slower service because you're white, and you believe the family next to you received faster service because they're black. Is that accurate?" The man's face flushed slightly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And I find it completely unacceptable. We're paying customers, and we deserve the same level of service as everyone else." "You absolutely deserve excellent service," David agreed. "Every customer does, regardless of their race. But let me explain what actually happened with your orders." David consulted the tablet Sarah had handed him. "Your table ordered 2 appetizers that require 14 minutes of preparation time. The table next to you ordered appetizers that require 8 minutes of preparation time. They also have 2 young children, so our kitchen prioritized their children's meals as part of our family-friendly service policy, a policy that applies to all families with small children, regardless of race." The man's wife joined the conversation. "But we saw them get bread service before us too." "That's correct," David replied patiently. "They requested bread for their children immediately upon being seated, which we provided as part of our children's service. You didn't request bread service until after you had ordered your appetizers." David could see the family processing this information, their certainty beginning to waver. "Sir, I want to assure you that at Bella Vista, we provide excellent service to every customer based on their needs, their orders, and our established policies. We don't provide superior service to customers of any race, nor do we provide inferior service based on race. What you experienced tonight was standard restaurant operations, not discrimination." The teenager at the table spoke up. "Dad, maybe we were just being impatient. The food smells really good." The father looked around the restaurant, seeming to notice for the first time the diverse mix of customers and the professional, attentive service they were all receiving. His defensive posture began to soften. "Look, Mr. Coleman. David Coleman. Mr. Coleman, I guess I've been reading a lot of stories lately about businesses discriminating against white people, and maybe I was looking for problems that weren't there." David nodded, understanding. "Sir, I appreciate your honesty. And I want you to know that our commitment to equal treatment means exactly that, equal treatment for everyone. We don't favor any customers over others based on their race, and we work hard to ensure that every person who comes here feels welcomed and valued." The man extended his hand to David. "I owe you and your staff an apology. And I owe that family next to us an apology too, because I'm sure they heard me complaining about them getting special treatment when they were just being served as customers." As David watched the man walk over to the black family's table to offer a sincere apology, which was graciously accepted, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was exactly the kind of situation that could have escalated into a social media nightmare 6 months ago. Instead, it had been handled with professionalism, patience, and respect for everyone involved. Keisha appeared at his side as the family settled back into their meal, their earlier tension replaced by what looked like genuine enjoyment of their evening out. "That was perfectly handled," she said quietly. 6 months ago, would you have been able to navigate that situation with such calm confidence? David considered the question. 6 months ago, I probably would have offered them free dessert and spent the rest of the evening worried about negative reviews. I wouldn't have had the confidence to explain our policies clearly or the perspective to understand that their complaint wasn't necessarily about us. It was about their own fears and assumptions. And now I understand that treating people equally sometimes means treating them differently based on their needs, not their race. And I understand that real equality requires the confidence to explain your actions, rather than just apologizing for misunderstandings. As the evening wound down and the last customers finished their meals, David found himself in his office with Sarah, Keisha, and James, reflecting on how much had changed since that terrible day when Tyler Morrison had poured water on his daughter's head. "James," David said, "you can tell that story. All of it. The good, the bad, the painful, the hopeful. But I want you to be clear about something. This isn't a story about one restaurant fixing its problems. This is a story about what's possible when people commit to doing the hard work of building something better." As the group prepared to leave, David's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Coleman, this is Tyler Morrison. I wanted you to know that I completed the counseling program and have been accepted to a community college program in social work. I hope to spend my career helping people like I used to be. I know this doesn't make up for what I did, but I wanted you to know that your daughter's grace started something in me that's still growing. I hope someday I can make the world a little better because of what she taught me about forgiveness. Thank you for showing me that redemption is possible, even for people who don't deserve it." David showed the message to the others, then put his phone away without responding. Some things didn't require a response. They required time, continued growth, and the understanding that redemption was a process, not a destination. As he locked up Bella Vista that night, David thought about his daughter, now 9 years old and still collecting rocks, still wanting to be a veterinarian, still carrying within her the kind of grace that could transform broken people into whole ones. She had experienced hatred and discrimination at age 8, but she had also learned that people could change, that forgiveness was a choice, and that love could triumph over fear. Bella Vista was no longer just his restaurant. It had become something bigger, a proof of concept for the idea that institutions could acknowledge their failures and build something better. A demonstration that diversity and inclusion weren't just moral imperatives, they were the foundation for creating spaces where everyone could flourish. 6 months ago, Tyler Morrison had poured water on David's daughter in an act of racial hatred. Tonight, families of every background shared meals in a restaurant that had been transformed by that terrible moment into something beautiful and welcoming. The circle wasn't just complete, it was expanding, creating new possibilities for connection, understanding, and hope. As David drove home to his family, he smiled thinking about Zoe's latest rock collection and her plans to open a veterinary practice that would welcome all animals, regardless of their breed, size, or background. She was still his daughter, still innocent in many ways, but also wise beyond her years about the power of forgiveness and the possibility of change. Some stories end with justice. Others end with redemption. The best ones, David realized, end with love, not as an ending, but as a beginning.